I was silenced by my sister-in-law and saw my family manipulated until I turned the tables. I never imagined I'd get to the point of writing about this in public, but there was a day in my life that changed everything. To this day, I remember every detail, as if it were etched into my skin. It was just another morning, but inside me, it weighed heavily. I was tired of swallowing hard, of smiling to avoid an argument, of being told I was weak, ungrateful, and useless. I lived in an environment where everything was decided by someone else, and worst of all, that person wasn't my father nor my brother. It was my brother's wife. She positioned herself as the mistress of the house, as the one who knew everything, and I felt increasingly diminished. I carried anger and shame at the same time, because it seemed I lacked the courage to react. But on that particular day, when I overheard her conversation on the phone, something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to take it anymore. I was walking down the hallway when I heard Marta speaking softly, but not so quietly that I couldn't understand. She said she was going to sell my mother's house, the only concrete memory I had of her. My mother had passed away a few years before, and that place was where I felt close to her. The smell, the furniture, even the marks on the wall reminded me of her. Hearing Marta planning to get rid of it as if it were nothing made me tremble. At first, I felt a huge panic. My body went cold, but then came a rage that seemed to set me on fire. I stood still, listening, trying to absorb what was happening, and at the same time, a voice inside me screamed that I could no longer remain silent. The pain became fuel. Until that moment, I had grown accustomed to living in silence. I avoided arguments because every time I tried to speak, she turned on me. My father, who had previously been my safe haven, seemed mesmerized by her. He said Marta was taking care of the family, that I should be grateful. And my brother, blinded by love or whatever, defended her every word. I was the stranger in my own home. The worst part was the isolation. I had a cousin, Nade, who always supported me, but Marta managed to plant intrigues even in that. I lost allies and became alone. But that day, listening to her negotiate the sale of something that was sacred to me, I realized that silence was no longer an option. Either I acted, or I would lose my mother for the second time. I remember feeling my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I walked quietly to my room and closed the door. I sat on my bed and cried silently. It was a mixture of despair, fear, and a courage I couldn't quite put my finger on. I thought, if I face it, they'll call me crazy, they'll expel me, they'll say I'm ungrateful. But at the same time, within the pain, I felt a strange clarity. It was as if for the first time I understood that no one was going to save me, that if I didn't get up, they would destroy every last piece of my story, and I wouldn't let it. It was as if I'd woken from a nightmare. After taking a deep breath, I decided I would commit it all to memory, but I also needed proof. I grabbed a notebook and began writing down what I'd heard, the time, the words. I wrote everything down because I knew that, alone, if it were just my word, no one would believe it. I felt like a detective in my own home, but it was either that or surrender. I was trembling, but I kept writing. That was when the different Leticia was born, the one who would stop accepting and start reacting. That was the first step. At first, I thought I was becoming paranoid, that maybe I'd misunderstood her conversation. I spent the rest of the day stewing over it, my stomach churning. But when I went to the kitchen for a drink of water, I heard it again. Marta was talking to someone on her cell phone, very irritated, saying she needed the money quickly, that Renato couldn't know yet that it was best to resolve everything quickly before I or anyone else found out. With each sentence, I felt my blood boil. I wasn't imagining it. She really was planning to sell. That was when it hit me. Either I act, or I'd watch her destroy the only thing that still connected me to my mother. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold my glass of water, but it was then that the anger transformed into a strange force. I decided I wouldn't go around accusing her without proof. I already knew that if I did, my father would look at me with that look of disappointment, as if I were the ungrateful one in the story. And my brother, not to mention, would defend Marta tooth and nail. So I started to pay more attention. I paid attention to every word she said, every phone call. I was afraid of getting caught, of her realizing I was watching, but I was also afraid of doing nothing and then regretting it for the rest of my life. It was like walking a tightrope. I hid my notes inside a book that no one ever read. With every detail I recorded, I felt like I was assembling an invisible weapon. It was painful, but it gave me a glimmer of hope. I remember one night in particular when everyone was already asleep. I was in my room, alone, and I opened that notebook. I read every single thing I'd written and cried again. Not because I felt defeated, but because I finally realized it wasn't my madness. It was all there, real. I saw myself for the first time as someone who could fight. With tears still streaming, I swore to myself that I wouldn't let her destroy my mother's memory. I might not have had money, I might not have had support, but I had something she didn't, the truth. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, I felt I wasn't completely lost. The fear, of course, was still with me. I was terrified she'd discover I was gathering information. I was terrified my father and brother would turn their backs on me for good. But along with the fear came a clarity. I no longer needed to wait for someone to defend me. I had to defend myself. This mix of feelings consumed me, but kept me going. It was as if with each humiliation I remembered, I grew stronger. Sometimes I even repeated under my breath, I won't let her win. I felt anger, yes, but also a new hope, a desire to show that I wasn't the weak girl they said I was. It was at this point that I began to plan what to do. I knew it wasn't enough to just keep the information hidden. I needed to find a way to expose the truth in a way that couldn't be denied. I spent days thinking about how. I didn't have much experience. I didn't know anything about the law, but I knew I needed allies. I considered reaching out to my cousin Nate again, despite all the chaos Marta had caused between us. Deep down, I trusted her. Just imagining having someone by my side made me breathe easier. It was as if that plan were my light amidst all the chaos. I remember as if it were yesterday the day I summoned the courage to call Nita. My hands were sweating so much I almost dropped the phone. I was nervous because I didn't know if she still believed me after all the intrigue Marta had concocted. But I had to try. When she answered, I took a deep breath and said, "Nide, I need to talk to you, seriously." There was a silence on the other end that seemed eternal, until she replied, "I'm listening." It was a relief, but also a huge pressure. I told her everything, from the conversation I'd overheard to the notes I'd been taking. My voice was shaking, but I kept going. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a few seconds, and I thought she was going to hang up. But then she said, "I knew something was wrong. You were right to reach out to me." I cried. For the first time in a long time, I felt I wasn't alone. With Need by my side, I began to feel more secure. She advised me to keep any possible evidence, messages, dates, even small comments. She said that, if necessary, we could use it legally. I had never considered that. I just wanted to protect my mother's memory, but suddenly I realized I was also protecting myself. It was as if a curtain had opened and I saw that this wasn't just a family dispute. It was about rights, about dignity. I started writing down even more things, and Need even lent me one of her old recorders to record some conversations. The fear remained, but now it went hand in hand with hope. The real turning point came a few days later. Marta was in the living room, talking to someone about selling the house, and I managed to record almost the entire conversation. My heart nearly leaped into my throat, because at any moment she might notice. But I stood firm. When I listened to the recording later, alone in my room, I trembled from head to toe. There was no denying it. It was all there, clear. Her voice, her plans, her rush to get rid of my mother's possessions. In that moment, I felt something I can't quite explain. It was fear, anger, relief, and courage all rolled into one. I knew I finally had the weapon I needed, but along with courage came despair. What to do with it? I still lived in the same house, still dependent on my father for many things. If I dropped the bombshell, I might end up being thrown out with nothing. I spent the night awake thinking. I paced my room, hugging the recorder. I cried again because it felt too heavy for me. But deep down, I knew. This was the beginning of my end as a victim. I couldn't go back. The fear of losing my home mixed with the certainty that if I kept quiet, I would lose myself. The next morning, I woke up different. My face was still swollen from crying, but my gaze remained firm. I knew what I had to do. Show everything to Need first. If I rushed into things with my father or my brother, I'd be branded a liar once again. So I went to her house, hiding the recorder like a treasure. When I played it and she heard Marta's voice, the shock on her face assured me I wasn't crazy. She looked at me and said, "Letitia, now you can turn this around." It was the first time I'd heard that from anyone, and it felt like a ton had been lifted off my shoulders. In the days that followed, I focused on organizing everything securely. Every note, every recording, every detail I remembered was recorded. I didn't want to make a mistake. The anxiety was overwhelming. I was afraid of being discovered, of losing my nerve along the way, but at the same time, I felt a new clarity, a sense of control I'd never felt before. For the first time, I was the one deciding what would happen in my own life, and that gave me the strength to face any backlash. I felt a mixture of fear and power coursing through my veins, and it was hard to explain. My confidence grew as I reviewed everything with Need. She told me, "Now you know you can face anything, because you have the truth on your side." Those words stuck with me in a way I'll never forget. I began to feel lighter, even with my heart racing. Before, I lived as if I had invisible chains binding me. Now, every piece of evidence, every detail recorded was a step toward cutting those chains. I began to believe I could show everyone that I wasn't weak, that I didn't deserve to be humiliated, that my mother didn't deserve to be forgotten. The day came when I decided to act. My father was home, and I waited for a moment when he was alone. My stomach ached with anxiety. My hands sweated, but I knew I couldn't wait any longer. With Knight on the phone, I began showing him every piece of evidence I had gathered. He remained silent, looking at me with a mixture of shock and disbelief. I was afraid he wouldn't believe me, afraid of being ridiculed, afraid of losing everything again. But I remained steadfast, because now my determination was stronger than any fear. When my father finally spoke, admitting he'd never realized the manipulation, I felt a wave of relief and sadness at the same time. Relief at finally being heard, sadness for everything he'd lost by believing someone else. My brother was still blind at first, but the clarity of what I was presenting began to reach even him. I realized that even if everyone wasn't immediately on my side, I had taken the most important step, reclaiming my voice. I was finally acting on my own, without relying on anyone's approval. In that moment, for the first time, I felt a mixture of power and peace I never imagined I would feel. Everything I had, bottled up from years of humiliation, all the silent tears, all the feelings of helplessness, began to transform into strength. I still felt pain, still carried scars, but I knew I would no longer be defined by them. For the first time, I was in control, showing that no one could decide for me or diminish my worth. I had taken the first step toward freeing myself from the shadow that had haunted me since my mother's death. In the days that followed, the tension in the house changed completely. My father began to see things differently. My brother took a while, but he began to realize something was wrong. Marta realized she could no longer manipulate anyone as easily. It was strange, but at the same time liberating. I still felt scared, not knowing how she would react, but the feeling that I finally had my own space and my own voice was immense. For the first time in a long time, I no longer had to shrink. I began to reclaim the little things that once made me feel alive. I cleaned my mother's room, touched the objects she'd left behind, smelled the perfume that still lingered, and cried with relief. It was as if I was breathing after years of holding my breath. I felt my strength returning. It wasn't just the courage to face Marta or prove something to my family. It was my own identity returning, the feeling of being myself without fear, without shame, without depending on anyone's approval. There are still moments when anger and sadness surface. It's impossible to forget everything overnight. But now, when I feel these emotions, I can see them differently. I know they're part of my story, but they'll no longer define who I am or how I live. I've learned that I can transform pain into strength, that I can act even when it seems impossible, and that it's okay to feel fear, as long as it doesn't paralyze me. Today, I can talk about everything without feeling small. My story isn't perfect. It's not clean, but it's mine. I've managed to recover what seemed lost, and, most importantly, I've recovered my voice. The feeling of freedom is indescribable. Every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of despair was worth it. I'm living proof that it's possible to turn things around, even when everything seems to be against you, even when no one believes you can win. My name is Letitia. I'm 24 years old, and I'm sharing this here because I know what it's like to feel trapped, silenced, and helpless. But I also know what it's like to find the strength to bounce back. I still carry marks and scars, but they no longer define me. I've learned that courage is born the moment you decide you'll no longer accept being diminished, that there's nothing more liberating than reclaiming your own voice, and that, even when surrounded by betrayal and control, It's possible to transform pain into victory.